What would you do if the person sitting across from at the most elegant dinner of your life looked at your dress, looked at your face and said, loudly, deliberately, with the full attention of every person in the room, "Who let the help in through the front door?" What would you do if the wine came, not accidentally, not a slip of the wrist, or a stumble on deliberate, the glass tilted with intention, the deep red spreading across the ivory fabric of your dress like something, like a verdict being delivered in public, while the room watched and the chandeliers kept burning and the man you loved stood 3 feet away? And what would you do if she leaned down, close enough you could smell her, something expensive and sharp, the kind that costs more than most people's monthly rent, and said, directly into you, "You will never have the class to wear real diamonds. People like you don't get to sit at tables." I'll tell you what. I sat very still. I breathed. I let the wine soak into the fabric, and I looked at her with an expression that gave away, because I have been trained to give away nothing. And while she straightened up and smoothed her gown, and accepted the delighted expressions of her friends, as though she had just performed something admirable, I thought about the phone call I had not yet, the one I was going to make in approximate. She didn't know. None of them. The man who had laughed, Julian, my Julian, standing by the fireplace, his champagne glass, and his practiced social, he didn't. None of the gleaming, decorated, expensively maintained people in that gilded museum hall had any idea that in less than 8 minutes, the heaviest doors in the building were going to open, and the one man on the continent, whom every person in that room would have stepped over each other to impress, was going to walk through them and ignore every single one of them entirely. He was going to walk directly to the woman with the ruined dress and the wine-stained hands sitting alone at the and he was going to. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you who and why I was sitting in that room in an unbranded ivory dress with no jewel and a name that wasn't mine. My name, the one I had been using for the past 14 months, the one on my employee badge at the Hartwell Archive Institute, the one Julian knew, the one his ex-girlfriend Celeste had sneered at when she first heard it, was Clara Whitmore. Clara Whitmore was an archival researcher. She catalogued letters, ledgers, and land documents from the 17th and 18th century. She took the train to work. She ate lunch at her desk more often, usually something had packed herself, because the good sandwich shop near the institute closed at noon, and she rarely finished her morning session. She wore her hair in a low knot, because it was practical, and she wore clothes that were clean and carefully pressed, but never conspicuous, because Clara Whitmore had no reason. Clara Whitmore was a very well-constructed. She was also entirely fictional. My real name is Seraphine Aldrich, and I am the only legitimate heir to the sovereign duchy of Vosmar, a small but extraordinarily wealthy municipality whose territorial rights, mineral claims, and ancient treaty agreements make it one of the most legally significant private sovereignties in the continent. The current duke, my uncle, Edvard Aldrich Voss, has governed Vosmark for 31 years with a combination of medieval seriousness and modern legal precision that has made him both deeply respected and genuinely feared by people who understand how he has no. The succession has always. I have known this since I was 9 years old, and my father explained it in the kind of direct, unhurried language that very serious men use when they want a child to understand that something is not negotiable. I grew up with tutors, with protocol lessons, with a working knowledge of 6 languages and the specific etiquette requirements of 3 different diplomatic contexts. I grew up knowing that every person who entered my orbit needed to be evaluated for the possibility that they wanted something from the title before they wanted anything from me. By the time I was 29, that evaluation process had cost me 3 relationships and something I can only describe as the slow erosion of my ability that warmth was ever So I did what I had been quietly planning. I arranged the details with my uncle's reluctant blessing and Hendrik's absolute operational precision. Hendrik being my head of security, a man of very few words and competent, who communicated primarily through status report and mild I created Clara Whitmore. I took the position at the Hartwell Archive, which required genuine expertise in historical documentation that I actually had, because I had studied archival science for 3 years as a personal interest that had started as an escape and become a genuine. I found an apartment in the city, a real apartment, nothing special, with a radiator that knocked in winter and a view of the street below where I could watch people walk their dogs. I gave myself 1 year as Clara, 1 year to exist without the weight of succession, without the protocol, without the particular loneliness of being surrounded by people who were always performing for the title rather than talking. I met Julian Marsh in the 3rd month. He was at the Hartwell on a research visit. He worked in acquisitions for a private art foundation and needed access to provenance documentation for a collection of 18th century correspondence. He got the access times wrong, arrived 40 minutes early, and was standing in the reception area looking at a framed reproduction of a medieval manuscript with an expression of genuine interest that I noticed from across the room. Not the performed interest of someone trying to be a culture, the real thing. Leaning slightly, head tilted, actually reading. I asked if he'd help orienting himself before his appointment. He turned and looked at me with brown eyes that were warm in a way I had learned to distrust but couldn't immediately dismiss, and said, "I think I came on the wrong day, actually, but this place is extraordinary. Have you worked here long enough? What are you looking for?" "Document," he said, "but also if you have time, maybe a coffee? You look like someone who knows where the good coffee is." It was not a sophisticated opening. It was also, I could tell the difference. I had been trained to tell the difference. We had coffee in the small cafe, 2 streets from the inn. He talked about the provenance, which he found genuinely interesting, and about the art found, which he found genuinely frustrating, because his director had opinions about historical that were not supported. He asked about my work, without using it as a transition to talk more himself. He listened when I said something about a 17th century Flemish merchant ledger I'd been catalogued, and why the handwriting suggested the scribe had been ill in the final third of the document. He looked at me with a focused attention that felt like being taken seriously, which is rarer than it should be. We met again the following week, and the week after that, and by the 6th week, we were meeting 3 times a week, without either of us making a formal declaration about what we were doing, because it didn't seem to require one. It was simply where we both went. The coffee shop, then evening walks along the canal, then dinners at small restaurants, where he always looked at the menu with genuine indecision, and always chose something he then admitted was better than what he'd originally. He was not wealthy, comfortably employed, careful with money, the kind of person who knew the difference between something worth saving for and something not worth having. He had grown up in a mid-sized city with a father who repaired clocks and a mother who taught secondary, and he talked about both of them with an uncomplicated affection that I found every time, moving in a way that snuck past my defenses before I could organize. He told me, on an evening in November, when we were walking back from a gallery opening he had been invited to for work, and I had come along as his guest, that he had been in one serious relationship before this, for 2 years, with a woman named Celeste. He said it carefully, the way people mention things they want to be honest about, but are not sure how to frame. He said that Celeste came from a wealthy family, that the relationship had been intense and ultimately not good for either of them, that she had a way of making the people around her feel that they were constantly auditioning for a role in her life. He said, "I don't think I knew how I was spending until I thought about, are you happy now?" A simple, the kind that is harder to than it sounds. He looked at the canal lights were doing something very ordinary and very beautiful. "I think I'm getting," he said, and then, quietly, "Are you?" "Yes," I said, and I meant it. Clara Whitmore, in her modest apartment with the knocking radiator and the dog walk, was genuinely, specifically happy, in a way that Seraphine Aldrich Voss had not been in. We fell in love. I will not dress it up more than, because the truth of it doesn't require depth. It was the kind of love that builds itself slowly from accumulated ordinary moments. The particular way he set a mug of tea on my desk when he visited me at the institute, always on the left side, so it wouldn't be in my working hand. The way he remembered, 3 weeks later, something I had mentioned about a document struggling with, and asked how it resolved. The way he moved, with a decency that was not performed, because there was no audience performing for. He thought I was an archivist, with a modest salary and a passion for old paper. He loved me as exactly, completely, and without reservation. For 8 months, it was enough to make me believe the fiction could last. Then Celeste, she arrived in Julian's life the way certain people, not through a door he had opened, but through a social environment that simply reassembled around her presence. A mutual acquaintance's dinner party. Julian came home from it slightly quieter, and when I asked about the evening, he told me Celeste had been there, that it had been fine, that she had been he said, cordial, with the particular care of a man chewing a word to, I believe, in that I was. Celeste made her presence known in Julian's social circle through means that were entirely and entirely disguised as coincidence. She appeared at gallery events. She appeared at dinner tables. She was, by every external measure, glossy and precise, and in full command of every room she entered. A woman of 32 who wore her family's money with the ease of someone who had never once had to think about it, who dressed in pieces that were not merely expensive but specifically, knowledgeably expensive, the kind of choices that signal not just wealth, but education in wealth. She wore a Parisian couturier's draped silk to events where everyone else wore merely good cocktail, and she wore it without visible effort, which was the point. The first time I met was at a wine tasting that June's colleague hosted. She was already there when, standing in the kitchen with a glass of something and talking to 2 women who were attending to her words with the kind of focus that attends someone who controls something desirable. She saw Julian. Her expression did something very quick and very interesting. A recalibration, a reassembly, a decision made in under a second. Then she looked at. The look lasted approximately 3 seconds. It was the look of a person conducting a complete social assessment and finding the subject not threatening, but, more insultingly, irrelevant. Then she smiled at Julian with the warmth of someone who had never been anything but fond of him, and said, "You should have told me you were coming. I would have saved you a glass of the—" It was spectacular. The implication, she had known what was there to be. She had access. She had not said, and he had missed it because of the choices. Clara, drawing me slightly. "This is Celeste Vane." "Hello." "Clara," she repeated, as though tasting the word and finding it unremarkable. "What a practical—" She turned back to Julian. Over the following weeks, the microaggressions arrived with the regularity of a drip from a faucet, each one individually small enough, collectively. At a dinner, where the conversation turned to travel, she asked me brightly which countries I'd visited, and when I named several, carefully selecting only the ones Clara Whitmore would have been to, places that were plausible on an archivist's budget, she tilted her head and said, with a sympathy so precisely calibrated it could have been measured, "Oh, that's a lovely, very accessible." The word accessible delivered with the tenderness of someone describing a child's drawing. 3 weeks later, at a gallery preview Julian had been invited to for professional reasons, she arrived wearing a cream wool Chanel suit that managed to make every other woman in the room look slightly improvised, and stopped beside me to painting and said, without preamble, "That dress is from the high street. I can always tell by the seam. You really are very brave." Then she walked away to speak with the gallerist, leaving the observation suspended in the air behind her, like something that couldn't be recalled. I said nothing. I looked at the painting. Inside, in the place that was not Clara Whitmore, but was Seraphine Aldrich Voss, something went very quiet, very cold, the way rooms hold when a window is left open, steadily, complete, without. The third encounter was the one that told me what Julian's colleague organized a pre-gala gathering at a private members, a dinner for 12, before the Hartwell Museum's annual fundraising, which was the event I had been told about, and which mattered because the Hartwell Museum housed, in its permanent collection, several pieces of significant provenance, and my uncle's foundation was a named donor. I had known for weeks. I had not known, until we arrived at the pre-dinner, that Celeste would be seated directly across from me for the first course, or that she had spent the seating arrangement conversation repositioning herself there by suggesting to the host that she would be so much to talk to if she were across from little girl rather than. I know this because one of the other guests, a woman named Patricia, who had known Celeste for years and seemed to regard her with the weary familiarity of someone who has long since decided they can't leave a situation but can at least witness, told me in a low voice. She asked to move her seat. "I thought you should." I thanked, but I filed the. At dinner, Celeste was immaculate. She spoke across me more often. She referenced 3 times experience she and Jude had shared, a trip to a particular restaurant in Paris, an opening they had attended, a group of friends who were apparently all at a level of social connection that required a specific type of knowledge to navigate, in a way that was purely a marking of ground, in a language that was designed to mill the ground with. When I spoke, she listened with the polite attention of someone waiting for a pause rather than receiving. When I made a point about the Flemish provenance research I was currently, and one of the other guests showed genuine interest and asked a follow-up, she redirected the conversation to a film she had seen the previous weekend with a lateral grace that was so practiced it was almost admirable. Through all of this, Julian said nothing. He laughed at the right. He was warm and present and entirely, deliberately oblivious in the way that people are oblivious when being aware would require them to act, and they have not yet decided to. I noticed. I said nothing. I made a mental note that had a quality of finality, the note of someone beginning to understand and then the gala, the Hartwell Museum, dressed in its winter best, all candlelight and polished marble, and the smell of fresh flowers and old money competing with each other in the high sea. The dress I chose was ivory, simple, clean, beautifully made by hands whose identity I will not share, because Clara Whitmore would not have been wearing it if anyone looked closely, but which from 10 feet looked entirely no jewelry, no adornment, nothing that would draw the eye for the wrong reason. Celeste arrived in burgundy silk, floor-length, with a necklace of pavé diamonds that I recognized from a jewelry house whose waiting list operates in years. She looked at me when we met at the entrance, and she did not bother to conceal the assessment or its conclusion. She looked at my dress with the slow, deliberate attention of someone making a point, and she said, to the woman beside her, not to me, to the woman beside her, while I was standing directly in front of her, "Someone let the help in through the front door again." The woman beside her laughed, a small sound, quickly swallowed, but real. Julian heard. I know he heard it because his jaw moved in a particular way, a tightening, a brief registration, and then release, and he said nothing. He turned to speak to someone approaching from his left, and the moment passed for him was absorbed and moved, while I stood in the entrance to the Hartwell Museum in my ivory dress, with the echo of it still in my. I breathed. I walked in. I found my place at the table, which was not near Julian. The seating, I suspected, had been managed again, and I sat down, and I accepted a glass of water from a passing server, and I looked at the room with the expression of someone composed because they know something that no one around. The wine came. Celeste was standing by. I didn't hear her approach. The room was full of conversation and the clink of crystal, and the first indication I had was a coldness spreading across my right shoulder and down the front of my dress, immediate and total, followed by the sharp and dark, a good Bordeaux ruined on. She stepped around to face me as the room began to register what, and she looked down at me with an expression that was clinical and satisfied and entirely without apology, and she said, loudly enough for the 8 people nearest her, whoops, but honestly, it's not as if you were never going, you don't have the you don't have a pause, her diamond necklace, and you will never, ever have the class to. People like just don't. The room did not go silent all at once. It happened in stages, the way silence spreads across water when something heavy has been dropped into it, moving outward in rings point of impact. The table nearest to us first, then the next, then the long central table where the museum's board members sat in their evening clothes. The quartet near the far wall played on for approximately 4 more seconds before the first violinist registered the quality of the quiet spreading to and let her bow hands slow. Then it was completely still. Celeste stood above me in her burgundy silk, and the candlelight did something very specific to her diamond neck. It caught every facet and threw small points of light across the table, across my ruined dress, across the marble, like something being scattered. She had the expression of a woman who has rehearsed a moment so many times in private that the public execution of it, I did not. I want to be. There was no trembling lip, no stinging behind the eyes, no any of the things that Celeste had calculated, the visible proof of her assessment delivered in front of the right order. What happened instead, inside me, in the place that was not Clara Whitmore, was a complete and absolute settling. The way a compass, the way a very old door closes on a very well-oiled mechanism, not with a slam, but with a sound so final it needs no emphasis. I looked up at her. I looked at her for exactly long enough to let her see that I was not afraid, not humiliated, not performing the devastation she had written the script for. Then I looked away, not dismissively, simply done. I reached into the small evening bag on the table. Inside was my phone, not the modest device that Clara Whitmore, but the other one, the one that lived in that bag and had made exactly 4 calls in the 14 months I had been living as, because there had been exactly 4 sit required. I typed a message to Hendrik, 6 words, bring the Duke in. Now. I set the phone face down on the table beside the wine-soaked edge of the cloth and folded my hands in and waited. Julian. I had not seen him cross the room, but he was there now, standing at the edge of the cleared space that the watching crowd had unconsciously created around Celeste, and his face had the specific expression of a man who has arrived at the conclusion of an event he was not present and is trying to reconstruct the. He looked at my dress. He looked at. His jaw tightened in the same way it had tightened at the entrance, that brief registration, that internal note. Then Celeste turned to him, and her expression shifted with the of a practiced performer, the satisfaction replaced by something softer, a brightness in the eyes that said simply, you see how I command this room, you see where you belong and where she doesn't? And Julian, my Julian, with the brown eyes and the careful word choices, and the way he placed the mug of tea always on my left, looked at his for one moment, and then he looked up and said, Celeste, that was an act, I'm sure. Not, that was wrong. Not, don't speak to her. Not, Clara, I'm sorry. An accident. I heard it. The word landed with the weight of everything it was choosing not to say. I looked at him across the space between us, and he met my eye, and something passed between us that was not a conversation, but was a conclusion. I looked away. The room had not fully re-engaged. People were still watching, some with the open curiosity of those who have no social investment in the outcome, some with the careful sideways attention of those who do. Celeste's 2 friends, standing slightly to her left, were wearing identical expressions of delighted, the look of people who have watched someone do something they were too cowardly to do themselves, and are now waiting to see whether the reward justifies the risk. Celeste smoothed. She picked up her wineglass from a passing tray with the ease of someone who has concluded her business. Really, Ju, she said, with a warmth that was so precisely engineered, it made the air around it feel false. You could have done so much better. She said it like a friendly observation. Several of the guests within ear found things to look at. I sat with my hand. The wine on my dress had gone from cold to the ambient temperature of the room. The ivory fabric was entirely destroyed. The stain had spread from my right shoulder across the bodice in a pattern that had dried at its edges to something dark. I was sitting in a ruined dress in the Hartwell, in a room full of people who had just watched a woman tell me I would never deserve real diamond, and the man I had loved for had called it an act. None of them knew what was coming through. I heard it. The sound of the main entrance doors of the Hartwell Museum opening is not a delicate sound. They are doors that were built in 1887 from oak, reinforced with iron fitting. each one weighing approximately 400 kilograms, and when they are opened fully and with intent, the sound carries through the building with the low, resonant authority of something that does not ask permission. Every person in the hall heard it. The conversations that had cautiously resumed after the wine-ins stopped again, this time all at once, in the single clean break of a room responding to something it immediately recognizes as significant without yet knowing. Then the foot, not one set, many, coordinated, measured, the specific rhythm of people who have trained to move. And then they were visible through the archway that led from the entrance hall to the main gallery. 6 men in the dark dress uniform of the Vosmark Sovereign Guard, walking in pairs, their bearing so precise it looked architectural. Behind them, 2 more, and behind them, alone, unhurried, dressed in the severe and impeccable black of a man who has never once needed his clothing, my uncle, Edvard Ulrich Voss, the Sovereign Duke of Vosmark. He was 63 years old, and he moved like a man who had never in his life experienced the sensation of entering a room that was not already prepared to. His hair was silver white, his face deeply lined in the way of men who have spent decades making decisions with real and his expression, as he crossed the Hartwell Museum's main gallery, was one of complete focus. He was not looking at the donors, or the patrons, or the bejeweled wives of the city's most powerful men, all of whom had now oriented themselves toward him with the particular magnetism of people in the presence of someone they would very much like. He was not looking at Jules, or at Celeste, or at any of the gleaming, decorated people who had assembled for this evening to see. He was looking at me. He crossed the room without speaking to it. Guests moved out of his path, not because the guards created a corridor. They didn't. They simply walked. But because the quality of his movement communicated without ambiguity that he was going somewhere specific, and the furniture, structural or human, was secondary. A man in a dinner jacket who had been about to say something to his companion closed his mouth. A woman in emerald green stepped sideways without appearing to decide to do so. Celeste Vane was still holding her wineglass when the Duke of Vosmark stopped in front of me. He looked at me at the ruined dress, at my folded hands, at my face, which I had kept entirely still, and something moved the expression that was private and not for the room. A flicker of an uncle's anger contained immediate by a sovereign's discipline. Then he turned his head very and said, without raising one word, to the guard at his right shoulder. The guard stepped forward and opened the case he was carrying. I had seen the case. It was black steel, matte finished, with no external marking. It was secured with 2 physical locks and a biometric plate. The guard opened it, facing away from the room, not for secrecy, but because the contents were not for casual viewing, and the Duke had always believed that the first sight of something significant should be controlled. He lifted the lid and held the case. The Duke reached in with both hands. What he removed from the case was the Vosmark sovereign collar, the primary piece of the duchy's crown jewel, last worn publicly at my grandmother's state funeral 14. It was a wide, articulated collar of platinum and old gold, set with 117 stones, 64 diamonds of exceptional clarity, in sizes ranging from 3 to 11 carats, 41 sapphires, the precise deep blue of Vosmark's sovereign flag, and 12 rubies, old cut, from a mine that had been closed in the 18th century, and whose stones existed now only in a significant collection, and in the central stone, a diamond of 27 carats, internally flawless, pear-shaped, suspended from the collar's lowest point, had been valued most recently at slightly above 19 million. The piece entire was estimated at 20. It was the most valuable portable object in the room by a factor not close. The Duke walked to where I was, and he did something that caused the sound in the room, which had been absolutely nothing, to somehow become even more nothing. A silence below silence. The silence of 300 people stopped in the same moment. He knelt. The Sovereign Duke of Vosmark, the most feared and respected private sovereign on the continent, knelt on one knee on the marble floor of the Hartwell Museum in front of a woman in a wine-stained dress, and he placed the Vosmark crown jewels around her neck with the careful, practiced hands of a man performing a ceremony he has rehearsed for exactly this occasion. The platinum was cold against my skin for exactly 1 second before. The weight of it was extraordinary, not uncomfortable, but present, the way true weight is, reminding you of the substance. The central diamond came to rest at the hollow of my throat, and I felt the 27 carats of it settle with a specificity that no other weight. The Duke looked up at Your Highness, not for the room, in the clear, unhurried, entirely certain voice of a man making a statement of permanent record. The Duchy of Vosmark welcomes its future sovereign home. 300 people. I watched the understanding reach Celeste Vane's face. It did not arrive. It came in the way the room's silence first, a simple failure of the current framework to accommodate. Then, the beginning of comprehension, the pieces assembling themselves into a shape sheet. Then, the full arrival of it, complete and devastating, spreading across her features in a way she had absolutely no mechanism to, because nothing in her life had prepared her for this big failure. The wine glass moved in her hand, not enough to spill, but enough to show that her grip had, that something involuntary had happened in her body in response to what her mind was processing. I stood. The crown jewels moved with me, resettling against the wine-stained ivory of my ruined dress, and the contrast between the two was so visually total that several people later would never forget. The most valuable piece of jewelry on the continent, resting on fabric destroyed by a woman who had just said, "I would never deserve it." I looked at my "Thank you for coming," I said, in the even, unrushed cadence that years of protocol training make. Or "We were always," he said. He rose from his ease of a man who does not acknowledge the indignity does not follow. The foundation's donation required a personal signature. "You knew that." "I did," I said. He offered his arm. I took it. Then I turned, because there were things that needed to be said while the room could still hear them, and I have learned from my uncle that there is a specific kind of efficiency in choosing the right moment for the right word. And this. I looked at Jules. He was standing at the edge of the space the crowd had cleared, and his face had the open, undefended devastation of someone who is experiencing two things simultaneously: the full weight of what he had failed to do and the complete impossibility of undoing it. He understood, in the way people understand things they cannot metabolize quickly enough to act on, that the woman he had loved as Clara Whitmore was not who he had believed her to be, and that what he had allowed to happen in this room tonight was not merely a social failure, but something that would follow him for the rest of it, in the particular way that the moments you chose to stay silent always do. Julian, calm, level, not unkind, but absolute. The foundation will be entire ending archival. Hendrik will send the relevant correspondence. He opened. "Don't," I said, not angry, not wounded, simply, "There is nothing you can say that is proportionate to this moment." And I think he closed his mouth. His eyes were bright, with something I recognized and chose not to engage with, because engagement would have required me to care about his comfort, and I had spent the last several months carefully moderating my own comfort for his, and the account was now clear. I turned to Celeste. She had recovered some surface composure, I will give, because it is accurate. The glass was steady. Her chin was slightly elevated, the last available position of dignity in a completely lost, but her eyes were working too, moving between my face and the crown jewels, and my uncle's expressionless presence, doing the rapid, desperate recalculation of someone who had just realized the scale of the error there and is trying to find an exit that doesn't. "Miss Vane," she said nothing. The use of her last name, in this context, was its own communication. "The Hartwell Museum's primary benefactor," I said, "is the Vosmark Sovereign Fund. The Foundation's annual donation constitutes 43% of the museum's operating. My uncle, as Foundation, holds a seat on the museum's board under the standing agreement signed in." I let that settle for exactly 1 second. "He will be exercising the Foundation's right of conduct regarding this evening's event. I expect that process will conclude quite quickly." From behind me, Hendrik, who had entered quietly through a side corridor, while the room's attention was on the Duke, and who was now standing with the particular stillness of a man who has prepared every element of a situation and is waiting for the cue to deploy them, stepped forward and handed a sealed folder to a man I knew, museum's board chairman. The chairman opened it. He read the first page. The color in his face changed in a way that was visible from where I was standing. Celeste said, "You can't, Ms. Vane." My uncle's. He had not spoken since his initial statement, and the room responded to his voice the way rooms always respond to him, with the complete, instinctive attention that certain people command, without performing. He looked at Celeste with an expression that was not cruel, because it did not need to. It was simply a sovereign's gaze, measuring, categorizing, concluding. "The conduct review will include tonight's incident as its primary evidence. The museum's code of patron conduct is explicit regarding behavior toward members of any sovereign house or their representative, whether or not those representatives have identified publicly." He paused. "Your family's naming rights on East Wing were granted under the museum's patronage. That agreement contains a conduct." Celeste went very still. "I would suggest," the Duke said, "contacting your family's legal representation. The Vane family's naming rights on the Hartwell East Wing, a 20-year agreement negotiated 6 years prior, representing a significant portion of the social underpinned the Vane's position, were formally suspended pending within 11 days. The review concluded in 3 weeks. The rights were revoked. The East Wing was quietly renamed for a different donor. The ceremony was attended by people who were not the Vanes. Additionally, and this is the part that I understand mattered most, in the specific ledger that Celeste Vane kept of her life's value, Hendrik's team, in the course of the conduct review documentation, identified that 2 of the business held under Celeste's personal management the family accounts she had been operating a degree of personal discretion that the trust's other benefits were flagged to the trusts. The review of those accounts took 4 days. The outcome was a restructuring of the trust's management terms that removed Celeste's discretionary access entirely. The annual personal allowance she had been drawing was reduced to the base distribution available to all trust beneficiaries. It was, by most people's standards, still a significant sum. By Celeste Vane's standards, it was ruin. I was not present for any of those subsequent proceedings. I had returned to Vosmark within 10 days of the Hartwell Gala. My 14 months as Clara Whitmore concluded in the most complete and definitive way imaginable. I resumed my responsibilities in the succession, sat in 3 ministerial briefings, been waiting, signed the documentation that had been accumulating, and slept, for the first time in a long time, in my in the old, where the room at 70, and a view the original, and a radiator knock. I will be honest, I thought about the coffee streets from the Hartwell, and the canal walk, and the mug of tea always put on the left side. I thought about the man who had looked at a medieval manuscript in a reception with genuine, and how the man at the Hartwell Gala had also, and how both of them simultaneous, and neither of them. His message arrived 12 days later, through an official channel, addressed to the Vosmark Sovereign Foundation's correspondence, formal, handwritten on good paper, approximately 3 pages. I read it. It was sincere. It was thorough. It demonstrated that he understood and what his role in it, with a clarity that I believe was genuine, because it was uncomfortable in precisely the ways that genuine. I did not respond, not out of cruelty, not out of performance, but because there are conclusions that deserve to be respected rather than reopened, and this was one. The 14 months had been real. The love had been real. The ending was also real. All three. The crown jewels were returned to the Vosmark treasury the morning after the gala, cleaned and recertified, and locked in the vault where they had lived 104. But there is a photograph, taken by one of the museum's event photographers, who had been positioned near the east wing entrance, and who, in the way that photographers sometimes do, had simply kept working through the extraordinary minutes of that evening, because it was his job, and he was very good at it, of me standing at the moment, just after the Duke rose from his. My dress is destroyed. The crown jewels are resting against the ruined ivory fabric. My hands are at my side. My face is completely still. I look like someone who has always known. That is because true power does not arrive with noise. It does not require spectacle or performance or the approval of rooms full of people who are trying to determine it. It exists for the room assembled, and after it disperses. It cannot be ruined by wine, or diminished by a cruel word from a woman in borrowed, or made smaller by a man who chose his silence. It simply is, and when the moment requires it to become visible, it does so with a completeness that leaves no ambiguity and requires no second performance. I learned something during those 14 months as Clara Whitmore that I could not have learned as Seraphine Aldrich Voss. I learned that the love I wanted, that it existed in coffee and canal walk and late evenings over archival ledgers, that it was not a fiction invented by people who didn't know what the world was really like. I also learned that the love I wanted was not the same as the love, and that knowing the difference, it is the beginning of something precise. The photograph stays on, not as a monument to what happened, but as a reminder of what I know about. When the room goes quiet, and the wine has been spilled, and the doors are, I am always the one who knows what's coming. Now, if you have stayed through every moment, through the wine and the silence and the crown jewel and the cold absence, then you already know what you think about. You know whether Julian deserved more mercy. You know whether Celeste got exactly what she earned. You know what you would have done in that chair, with that wine spreading across your dress, with the room watched. What did you think of this masterful revenge? Did the snobby ex get exactly what she deserved? If you loved watching arrogance meet its absolute limit, if you felt something when those museum doors opened and the Duke walked past every billionaire in the room to kneel in front of the woman in the ruined dress, smash that like button, share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story of karma, power, and the precise, devastating satisfaction of the truth arriving exactly